So we've got this list over here of the various elements you have to know in order to learn Gemorah, some of which we've touched on already from before. But if you have the sense of these 19 different perspectives of what comes into a page of Gemorah, it's really helpful. And I keep reiterating the same point, which is Gemorah can look like a sea of information. And until such time as you have some kind of an insight into what the navigational points are, kind of the signposts of Gemorah, and until you have a concept, which is what we're looking at now, at what the structures or the substructures within Gemorah are, you can't do it. And so many times, including this week, I've seen people get up and try and teach Gemorah by just taking the piece. Gate. Somebody want to dial the gate? But just taking the piece of Gemorah and trying to break it down only in the context of that piece to teach people, it's quite limited. So, right? So that's what we're trying to do, something different over here, which is not to just take a piece of Gemorah and say, okay, let's unpack this piece of Gemorah. We're trying to get the core elements, the moving parts of what makes Gemorah's work. And then, no matter what you're studying, you can say, I recognize that. That makes sense. So let's go through some of the things that we've already looked at, and then we can get into the new things we haven't yet looked at. So number one, we said that a Gemorah might give us what we call a pirush, an explanation, and generally that's a lot of how Gemorah sections start. We start with a quotation from the Mishnah, and then we need to give a pirush. We need to explain what the Mishnah meant. And that's going to launch our conversation. That's fairly straightforward. Number two, we spoke about the idea of a shaila, as it's called in Hebrew, or a baya, as it is called in Aramaic, and that is a question that seeks information. And very often, if it's a baya in particular, it doesn't just seek generic information, it wants to know what's the halacha in this case. So we've got the various formats over here. Iboya lehu, right? Iboya lehu. Or ba'u or ba'a minei. Do you see that? Do you see those expressions? Now, what we're doing at this point is a little bit of a hybrid. On the one hand, we're looking at an entire substructure of a Gemorah. A baya is a substructure. It's an element of a Gemorah. It's one of the mechanisms that Gemorah uses, a baya, to pose a question, asking for halachic ruling. But at the same time, we're also identifying over here certain key words, because the more keywords we become familiar with, the better we are at signposting, basically, to understand, where we're supposed to be going with this. So you can see, again, Gemorah is written in Aramaic. So even though you and I would typically use the word shaila, what's a shaila? You go to ask the Rav, a shaila. I know what to do. I use the milk ladle to stir the chicken soup. So now I have a shaila. What am I asking? I want to know what's the halachic ruling. What do I do with the soup? What do I do with a spoon? What do I do with a pot? Or most importantly, what do I do with the person who put the wrong spoon in the pot? So
no one's asking, this is what's coming out of it.
Well, 1 second. So if I ask a shaila, that's in a personal capacity, I'm asking for a halachic ruling on a topic. When the Gemorah raises a baya, which is the same thing, it's just the Aramaic word, it could present in three possible ways, which are these three key words. One is iboya lehu. Obviously, I'm going right to left because we're using Hebrew letters, so it flows best from right to left. Iboya lehu. That means they asked them. Okay? Iboya lehu. They asked them. That sets the stage for us. That's telling us what's happening over here. Because very often what happens in the Gemorah is you've got a group of students studying together and a group of rabbis who are either teaching or on call to respond to the questions. So, Iboya lehu is this group now had a question. They went to the rabbis as a group to ask, well, what do we do in this case? What's the ruling in this case? Or you could have ba'u minei. Ba'u is a plural word. How do I know it's plural? Because if I've got a verb with the letter vav at the end of the verb, that tells me it's plural. So ba'u minei, they asked him. Okay, now a little bit of Aramaic Hebrew crossover, which is a little bit premature. We were going to look at this grammatical stuff at a later point, but it's always good to reinforce. So we'll bring it up now and then we'll look at it again later. One of the keys to understanding language, certainly in Hebrew, is to understand what the core of a word is and then what the prefixes and suffixes are. Because when you understand the suffix of a word and the prefix, but very often the suffix of the word, it gives you the context that you need. People get so stuck. Who's speaking to who? Are we asking a question, making a statement, So once you know things like prefixes and suffixes, they really help you to contextualize the direction of the conversation. Now, in Hebrew we'll say, I asked of you. I would say, I asked him actually. Mi menu is from him. I asked him a question. So the vav at the end of the word will be his. Again, if I have a verb and the verb has a vav at the end, it's a plural verb. But if I have a designation like from or to, and I have a vav at the end, it means it's him. In Aramaic, that same thing would be a suffix of a yud and a hey. So, minei, from him. Ba'u minei, they asked him. That means you've got a group of students sitting in front of their primary teacher. That's why he's in the singular. And they are now asking him what's the halachic ruling in this case. And the other variant is ba'a minei, an individual asking an individual. Now, if an individual is asking an individual, it could be a student to a teacher, or it could be a rabbi to his colleague. So I'd like to know, you're the expert in this particular field, so even though we're contemporaries, you're the expert, you tell me what's the ruling in this case.
That's genuinely asking a question.
Correct. Okay? What are we going to ask?
What's the relevance of who, what, how, singular, plural?
Okay, so like I say, we're going to look at a piece of Gemorah. It's going to look like a sea of words. And the more signposts we have to make sense of that sea of words, the easier it is for us to start understanding what's happening in the Gemorah. So, if I know that it's, let's say, Iboyeluhu, they are asking them, at least I know that the context over here is I shouldn't expect a single response. Because there's a group of people asking a group of people. They may now get multiple responses, which may start a whole conversation in the Gemara. And if I don't see that coming, I could be really confused. I don't understand what's going on over here. You were asking an halachic question, and now we've gotten into this whole discussion that seems to have nothing, how did that happen? So if I understand what's going on over here, that there's a group of people addressing a group of people, I can anticipate the possibility of multiple responses. Likewise, if I know that it's people asking a single person, the likelihood is that person is the halachic authority, which means that whatever he's going to say, most likely is going to carry a tremendous amount of weight. It may even be the final conclusion, even if there's a lot of debate and discussion around it, because they asked this individual, which implies that this individual is probably the halachic authority. I should anticipate that these words are going to carry a lot of weight.
If they're asking a group, does that mean there's no authority?
That means there's no singular authority in that group. There's nobody who stands out in that group. There's a whole group of rabbis of equal stature, as opposed to one person who is now seen as the guy to ask your questions to. So this is relevant. It's going to help me understand what to anticipate is going to happen next in the Gemara. But very important for our conversation, if it's a baya, a ba'a, ba'u, iboya, any of those variations, the person asking the question is not stirring the pot. The person asking the question has a genuine need. I need to understand what is the halachic ruling in this case. So I must anticipate that what follows next is a response in kind. This is somebody who's now going to be telling us what you should be doing practically, how this works practically. So when they do so, when they respond, what do we call it? What do we call it when somebody responds to a request for information? So in English, we'll say an answer. And in Hebrew, what will we say?
Teshuvah.
Teshuvah. What's the difference between an answer and teshuvah? Besides the fact that you already have the overtones of repentance because you heard the word teshuvah. Leave that out of it. Okay? What do you think lies at the root of this word teshuvah? Return. I'm coming back to you. You asked me a question. I'm coming back to you. Teshuvah. That means to say, I'm not for example, justifying a position, which might be another way of answering a question. I might be defending myself, which is another way of answering a question. I might even answer you with a bit of satire if I feel that your question was inappropriate. That's not a teshuvah. A teshuvah is, you came to me requesting information, I'm coming back to you.
Immediately.
No, the immediacy is irrelevant. The point is, I'm coming back to you. What do rabbis often say? I'll come back to you. So it's not necessarily immediate, but the point is, I'm replying with the information that you were seeking.
But they don't always give the answer.
No, of course not.
Isn't Teshuvah return to the truth?
Well, I'm returning with the truth in this case.
But I mean, so you
That's
say
what it
the
is.
truth.
I'm returning to you with the truth.
Uh,
So if it's a teshuvah, that means you asked for information, you wanted to know the halachic ruling on X and Y, and I gave it to you. Now that might precipitate a whole conversation and a debate, etc. That's fine. But what I did in my response to you is, I addressed your request. You wanted to know the halachic insight, I'm giving you the halachic insight. Even today, in a modern context, the term that we use for people who write responsa on modern halachic issues, we call them shut, which is an abbreviation for shailas utshuvas, which is effectively people made query about halacha, even how it applies in modern context. Somebody researched and responded to that. So the shaila was the request for information, and the teshuvah was the obviously investigated, researched response that was now published.
So that's the one you said, the Teshuvahs of Moshe Feinstein. That's
Exactly.
referring
Great
to-
example. So you'll say Igros Moshe, which is, in his humility, he called it the letters of Moshe, which is from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. These are his tshuvas. These are his responses to shailas that people gave him. It's exactly the same terminology that you could expect in the Gemorah, except the Gemorah will not use the word teshuvah. It won't say that somebody responded with that word teshuvah. We have to know that we're describing a teshuvah. Whereas in more contemporary writings, when I say contemporary, even from medieval times, they would have said, this is a teshuvah. And you might even hear about an halachic authority composing a teshuvah over a period of time. They're doing their research and they're composing a teshuvah to deal with X. So for example, during COVID, there were rabbanim who had to compose teshuvahs about what your responsibilities are about spreading or quarantining diseases, etc. There had to be a teshuvah. Somebody had to do the research and write up what you're supposed to do. When load shedding first started in South Africa, the Beis Din had to write a series of teshuvahs. What do you do with your urn that goes off and comes back on during Shabbos? What if you have a heating tray, etc., etc.? That's the modern version of the same principle. A teshuvah is somebody's done the research, unless they've got this information at their fingertips, which they often do in the Gemorah, and now they are responding to your halachic inquiry.
I might be jumping the gun here. I guess at a high level that makes sense. But how do you differentiate that from what we're going to come to the next part? How do you know the difference between them?
Okay, so how do you know the difference between an halachic response and a debate or challenge or proof text, etc.? So that's why this is so important to be able to determine. If somebody has posed an halachic question, Iboy Elohu, my da-da-da, what's the halach in this case? The response from the person, that's why it's so valuable to know who it's posed to. Once I get a response, either from an individual by name, or Amru lei, which is they responded to him, or the Amru lehu, they responded to them. As soon as I get their response, I know I've got a teshuvah now. Doesn't mean it's the final word, but I know that what's happened is somebody posed an halachic question and they received a response. I'll have to have all of the clues as to navigate what happens next. But I will know, because there was an Iboy Elohu and somebody spoke back, I know that that's a response.
So what is the English translation of Baya?
Baya is a question asking for a ruling.
I know, but what would the English...
Oh, a direct translation.
We can't read Hebrew.
So you're saying what would be a direct translation?
How would you say it in the English?
Okay, good. So I think, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, I'm not really familiar with the typical translations because, some people spend a lot of time using translated Gemorahs, so they'll become quite familiar with the terminology. I don't have that familiarity. I would assume that the language is going to be something along the lines of just simply, they asked, he asked. Because ask is a fairly generic word, There's no overtones. It doesn't imply that there's any kind of disagreement or challenge, etc. So it's the best word to use when somebody's asking for a halachic question.
It may not be relevant, you don't have to answer, but so when learning Gemara, this was the Judaism at the time.
Yes.
They consolidated that. So when you refer to the Bet Din making rulings, that's just the corner of Africa. They're also doing it in America. Where's the consolidation in today's?
Okay, so that's the truth of the matter is you're asking a very interesting question.
That's
Like,
what you ask.
how do you,
That's what you
right? How do you, how do you consolidate all of this information that's happening in real time in various places in the world? I think it's a lot easier today than it was in the old times, because let's go back. Let's say, for example, to one of the most famous responsa, which is called Shuvas HaRashba. Okay, so the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Aderet, and he lived, I can't remember the exact time frame in which he lived, but we're talking something like the 13th, 14th century, thereabouts. Okay, could be out by 200 years on either side, but you get the idea, right? Medieval times. So his responsibility is, you've got individuals who are writing their questions down and couriering. I mean, there was no postal service, right? So you've got to courier your letter, to the guy in another country probably, which takes whatever period of time, weeks to months, right? Then he has to do his research and then pen his response. And now he's got to send it not only to the recipient, he's actually got to make it available to other sages as well, so they could possibly weigh in. Today, these things are easy because we have technology. So the precipitation of information today is much easier than it was, and the collaboration is much easier than it was. So let's say let's just say for argument's sake, there's a hurricane in Florida and it takes out the electricity grid for a period of time, and they're running on generators, and the generators are coming up on and off and tripping, I don't know. They could very easily say, well, hang on a second, we know that there's a base in South Africa that's dealt with this issue. Let's just find the information, the research that they've done, and let's apply it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stuff published.
So that's the thing. What isn't published? Now that's a good question. So ironically, in earlier times, things were published, I don't want to say quicker, but people were more likely to publish because the amount of effort that went into teshuvah, and it wasn't easy to replicate. You wanted to have the thing available. So you ask a guy like Cliff, he'll go find it on some auction somewhere. He'll find some of the original books. Whereas today, things are very often just published on private websites and whatever the case, because there isn't necessarily that urgency to publish. And when a whole lot of stuff has been collated, then it will be published. Except for the big poskim, like the big internationally renowned halachic authorities, they will, as a matter of course, after they've collated a bunch of teshuvas that they've written up, publish it as a book. So it's a very different dynamic in today's world to how it was. Okay, so far we've got the three most straightforward elements of Gemorah. Pirush, an explanation of the Gemorah, of the Mishnah. Baya, otherwise known as a shaila, which is a request for information. By the way, the direct translation of the word ba'i means I need something. So you might occasionally see that word pop up, and it's not a question. Say, ba'i le, a person should have done X and Y. They were, it was required of them to behave in a particular way. So it's helpful for us because at least we know that when I'm asking a question which is a baya, means I need something. I need this answer. I need this information. And then we've got the teshuvah, which is the response to the request for halachic information. That's all very straightforward. What starts to make life difficult is when people challenge what's been taught. This is where Gemorah comes to life. Up until this point, let's be honest, you don't have to be Jewish. Say, ask a question, get an answer, big deal. However, one of the big deals about Gemorah is that we test every concept. We don't accept things at face value. And so you make a statement or you answer a question, you give an halachic ruling, and everybody else jumps in and says, how do we know that's true? Which is quite healthy, right? It makes for robust interrogation of principles. And that's where Gemorah starts to get sticky. Now, if somebody is going to challenge what you've stated as a halacha, there are two ways they can do that. Okay, we've already touched on this before, but it's good to reinforce. So let's use an example because it always helps to use examples. So let's use an example. Somebody asks, halachically, am I allowed to buy new clothes during this period of the Omer? Okay, every rabbi gets this at least once a year. Am I allowed? Rabbi, there's a big sale, and I really want to be able to get this item on the sale. Am I allowed to buy clothing during the Omer? Okay, so that's the baya or the shaila, right? Somebody's asking for the halachic insight. So the rabbi now has to give a teshuvah, right? The rabbi has to give a teshuvah. I think maybe one of the reasons it's called teshuvah is because sometimes after the rabbi has given his answer, he needs to do teshuvah, but that's another discussion. So the rabbi is now going to give his response, his teshuvah. So what's his response? His response is, yes, you may buy clothing during the Omer. It's not a problem. There's one from Nudnik in the shul who's horrified that the rabbis even said this. How could you possibly, my whole life, I've always known that you're not permitted to buy new clothing during the Omer. What kind of a heretic rabbi do I have? He's just said, go ahead, knock yourself out, buy clothes during the Omer.
They think they know a different answer.
Well, I'm just using a little bit more of a presumptuous individual. In the Gemorah, we're talking about people who are extremely learned. They're not just being nudniks.
But isn't it rude to say that to you?
If you're a nudnik, you're rude. If you're a great scholar, it's called robust debate. and it's really important for a person to know the difference. So this person makes the comment, he makes a halachic ruling, you're allowed to buy new clothing during the Omer. Let's say that I have a genuine concern that this might be halachically inappropriate. And I'm a great scholar of my own right. I'm not just the nudnik in shul, right? So how can I approach it? Let's just try to think logically. What would be a basis to challenge that ruling? What would be a valid basis to challenge that ruling? Let's just think logically.
Well, Tom, I mean, depends on which time in the Omer.
Okay, so that's, you're giving me a very specific example. I'm saying, well, what's a technique that I could use?
Example from the verse example.
Okay, source. So, right, text, example, right? So the first thing. What's that?
Isn't the rabbi answering?
Of course, the rabbi's answering. But did you know that? Did you know that he's answering the source? How are you supposed to know this?
What about a previous reading?
Okay, so.
That's the highest form, wasn't it?
Okay, so what are my options? My options are to come along to this rabbi and say, whoa, hang on a second. I read X. Now, I read a verse in the Torah, I read a previous ruling, I read a Mishnah, whatever it is. I read X.
I want a reference.
And, well, I'm bringing a reference, actually. I'm bringing a reference, and my reference appears to say differently to your ruling. So that's not a shaila anymore. A shaila was, I'm looking for you to provide me with insight. I'm looking for you to tell me the halacha. You've already told me the halacha. So now what am I doing? I'm raising a challenge against you. What we're going to see now is that there are two expressions we use for challenge, right?
Okay, so Shiloh, where do you get your source? You're still not.
No, shaila is not asking where to get your source. Shaila is asking, what's the halacha? I can ask as a shaila, and how do you know? I can ask that as a shaila. But that wouldn't be a confrontation. That would just be, I need to understand this better, which is completely valid. Now we're talking about a confrontation. Now, for people who generally know, excuse me saying this, a superficial perspective of Gemorah, they will lump all challenges under one umbrella called Akashya. Okay? Akashya. We're about to discover that is very, very frequently mislabeled. Now, you have to allow people to speak generically, right? You have to allow colloquialisms. You have to allow it, because that's how people are. But if you want to be more precise, a good portion, maybe even the vast majority of things that people call kashyas are not kashyas. Okay? Right. So what's a kashya?
Kasha wouldn't say it says in a brisa, I'm bringing something to counter.
So before we get to I agreed. Before we get there, what do you hear in the word kashya? Hard. You hear the word kasher. No, not kosher. That's spelled differently. You hear the word kasher. This is difficult. This is difficult for me to accept. Now, why would something be difficult for me to accept? Because I've seen evidence in a source. No, not because that's going to be the next step. Right? I've seen evidence in a source that to me I cannot reconcile with what you've just said.
It's academic.
It's academic and based in a source. I can't say the word fact because fact at this point is subjective. My kasha is from my understanding of the source, and what I want you to do now is either back down or help me re-understand the source. Now the problem is that when people see a kasha in Gemorah, unfortunately, what many people do is they impose their own perception of life onto the Gemorah, which means this. The minute a person sees that there's a debate in the Gemorah, they think about, if I was having a debate with somebody I know. And for many, many people, the objective of a debate is to be right. Now, that's the goal of the debate. Which means, or more correctly, the objective of the debate is to win. Which means that very often when people have a debate, they don't even care if what they're saying is genuinely true, as long as they can win the debate. So it's like what plays out in the courtroom, you know. It's not about objective truth. It's about who could either create enough doubt in the prosecution's case, or somebody who could bring some kind of precedent that helps their case, even if they know that possibly the person is innocent. You know, it's not purely objective. So we now impose this onto Gemorah because we think like this. If you made a statement that I didn't like, and I said I have a kasha on your statement, it's personal. I want to have one-upmanship. I want to be able to prove you wrong. That's how humans behave. So when humans learn Gemorah, they think the rabbis are doing the same thing. And it's the exact opposite of what the rabbis are doing. The rabbis are saying, we need to find objective truth over here. You've made a statement. If I am aware of any evidence in any other textual source that is misaligned with your statement, I owe it to the community to make you clarify this point. Not because I want to show you up, because I want to make sure that the point is clear. Because if I don't raise this question, some guy 200 years from now is going to misread that original text. And where's he supposed to find the answer? So I'm going to challenge you now so that you have the opportunity to clarify the point beyond doubt. That's why we call this robust assessment, robust investigation of principles.
It seems quite aggressive.
It is.
But
It is
that's
aggressive.
subjective. It seems like a very aggressive tone. It's not a discussion,
Correct.
it's an attack.
Correct. Exactly. Why? Because I'm attacking the integrity of the statement, not the person. And when you attack the integrity of a statement, you've got to be brutal. Because there's no room for niceties in law. Law has to be clear. Law has to be precise. We could go for a drink 2 minutes afterwards and be the best of friends. But when we're assessing the law, we have to be surgical. In exactly the same way as you don't want your best friend as your surgeon. Because you want somebody who can go in there and do what they got to do, no matter what the impact might be in the short term. Might be uncomfortable, might be painful, might lose some functionality of certain parts of the body. If that's what has to happen in order for the surgery to succeed, this surgery has to be brutal. And then when it's a successful surgery, you and the surgeon can be the best of friends. That's the principle over here. This is not about egos. This is not about, are we going to get more Beis Hillel votes or more Beis Shammai votes, or is Rabbi Akiva going to be the more popular rabbi, or it's not that. This is not about that. This is about a completely objective analysis of truth. And if you're analyzing truth, you have to be brutal in that analysis. Not brutal in your treatment of the people, but absolutely brutal in your treatment of information. Because if this information is slightly wrong in its presentation or slightly misinterpreted, you know what they say? They say, never read medical journals because you could die from a spelling mistake. It's that kind of principle. If we, remember the Gemorah is looking to establish core principles that will apply in all halachic issues across the span of history, when history will present scenarios that they couldn't think of in the time of the Gemorah. So you've got to have these principles. If these principles are not absolutely precise to the atomic scale, then we've got a problem in Judaism. So we have to be brutal. But as long as you understand that it's brutal conceptually, academically, and not personally, that is vital, just for understanding how Gemorah works. So, you get what is called a kashya. A kashya is where I have a quotation that seems misaligned with your ruling. That quotation can come from one of three places. A brisa, or stronger than that, a mishnah, or stronger than that, a verse in the Torah. When I say the Torah, it means the whole Tanakh, all the books of the prophets, etc. included. So, if we're posing that kind of a question, then the key word is Asive. Asive in the singular, Mesive in the plural. So Asive, he challenged, Mesive, they, the student body, challenged. But the principle is, I've now raised a kasha because you made a statement, and I'm familiar with some other text that seems to discredit your statement. Now, one or two outcomes could emerge. Either the person who made the halachic statement can illustrate, listen, valid point, except that you've missed a nuance and you haven't understood that quotation. And if I could illustrate that quotation means something different to what you imagined, then there goes the kasha.
But that's still put in the Gemara.
Of course it's in the Gemara, because we need to see this robust interrogation of concept. Or the person could say, ooh, didn't think of that. I'm going to step back.
So let's just take it's a request for a ruling, he gives an answer, and then a challenge.
Yes. Because there's nothing to challenge until a person has made an halachic statement. What are you challenging? The person says, I think the Mishnah is teaching X and Y. Okay, that's very nice. It's once you get into the halachic, that's where we start interrogating. So what are you actually saying? And how do you know this is accurate?
So what did the kasha be for the Omer?
Okay, good. So here's the Omer. It's going to be difficult because the idea of not buying clothes during the Omer is a custom that emerged much later on in history, so it won't be referenced. No, I'm saying, but it won't be referenced in a Mishnah or in a verse in the Torah, so it'd be very difficult to find a kasha in this way. However, what I could do is I could say, but look in the Shulchan Aruch, that would be valid. In our context today, the Shulchan Aruch, which is a much more latter-day book, has authority compared to our contemporary sages, like the Mishnah would have authority compared to the Gemorah. So here's the kasha. The kasha is, but it says clearly in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, in the laws of counting the Omer, that you may not purchase new clothing during this period. So there you go. You've got a black and white quotation. It says you may not purchase clothing. Rabbi, how could you say that it's okay to buy clothes? To which the rabbi would respond very simply. By the way, just to round off the issue, he'd respond very simply that you have to see context. Why are you not permitted to buy clothes during the Omer? Does anybody know why? Correct. Because
I wish you guys said
So the principle is that if there's a period on the Jewish calendar where misfortune happened to the community, we don't want to say Shehechiyanu at that time, because what does Shehechiyanu mean? Thank God for allowing us to live through this period. That's why you say Shehechiyanu at a Yom Tov. Thank God for allowing us to celebrate another Pesach. Thank God for allowing us to celebrate another Rosh Hashanah. So the reason not...
Did he just give you a kasha?
No. He gave a response to the kasha. The kasha was...
But with a kasha or...
No.
Oh, did he agree with what you said?
No, so like this. The rabbi made a statement. He gave so there was a shaila. The shaila was, can I buy clothes during the Omer? He gave a teshuvah. Yes, you can. Somebody raised a kasha, which is, but the Shulchan Aruch says you may not buy clothes during the Omer. So he now gave a tiritz, that's what it's called, as we shall see, or piruka, as we shall see. That is a resolution of the concept. And the resolution of the concept is basically to say, you didn't know the context. You read the text correctly, but you didn't know the context of the text. So the context was that we don't want to say the bracha of Shehechiyanu during a period of misfortune. Once upon a time, buying a new item of clothing was a big simcha, because there was no industrial revolution, there was no mass production of clothes. So to buy a new pair of clothing was a once, twice a year event. In the same way as it was a big chap to celebrate Pesach again, thank God we've survived another year. It was a big simcha to get clothes. Shehechiyanu. Thank God we made it to the point that we can have another suit.
So Shulchan Aruch is not really saying that.
Shulchan Aruch says that clearly.
No, but it's saying you mustn't buy newspapers because you can't say the bracha.
Correct.
You have to say the bracha.
So now the thing is this. Is there still a shehechiyanu when we buy clothes? That's the core question. Something's changed. Society has changed. It's no longer this big simcha. You could buy clothes literally every day. So there's a whole discussion, another halachic side discussion. Do you say shehechiyanu today when you buy new clothes?
Say shehechiyanu, not the buying of the clothes.
Exactly. If you don't say shehechiyanu, then it's not an issue to buy the clothes during the Omer, because the issue was only saying shehechiyanu. If the clothes don't make you say shehechiyanu, it's not a problem to have the clothes anymore.
Is that a kasha to the kasha now?
No, it's not a kasha. A kasha to the kasha would have been something along the line. How could you say that? Because we have either another source, or because we have kind of a logical problem with your proposal. Your proposal made sense. We're just providing context that clarifies why that is not relevant any longer.
Who has authority to change that law about saying shehechiyanu?
Again, so you've got to understand the core principle. That's why Gemorah spent so much time getting us to the principles. That's why we interrogate those principles so robustly. Because if I don't understand the principle of why you don't buy clothes in the Omer, I'll never know how to adjust it when circumstances change. But once I know the principle, that the principle is that any event in a person's life that gives them tremendous simcha because it's a very uncommon event, that's when you say shehechiyanu, then I understand why shehechiyanu was associated with clothes and why that's no longer relevant. If I didn't know the principle, I could never resolve this issue.
So by the same token, you don't have new fruit, you don't have new foods, you don't have anything.
So it's very interesting. It's very interesting because new fruit has become, of late, in the last, call it 2 decades, so clothes was already for longer. And even today, there's still people that say shehechiyanu on clothes. There's a big halachic school of thought that says there's no such concept as shehechiyanu on clothes anymore. It just doesn't exist anymore. And if you are going to say shehechiyanu, maybe it's for like, if you're buying a special outfit for like a wedding. I'm saying associated with a simcha, because that's not something which happens. Then you could say shehechiyanu. Fruit is becoming a big issue because of imports and refrigeration and GM food. The whole concept of shehechiyanu around fruit is becoming a big issue. Now, I don't think anybody yet has been bold enough to say we don't say shehechiyanu on fruit because it has an implication. For example, on Rosh Hashanah, the second night of Rosh Hashanah, there's a whole debate whether you say shehechiyanu on the candle, so we rely on the fruit. And because that is an entrenched custom of the Jewish people, as opposed to, there's no entrenched custom that you say shehechiyanu on clothes, but it's an entrenched custom of Rosh Hashanah that you say shehechiyanu on fruit on the second night. That's most likely why we haven't scrapped shehechiyanu for fruit. But it's logically highly problematic. You have to consciously choose to avoid eating a fruit for an entire season to facilitate saying shehechiyanu. So it's very tricky, right? I'm saying you'd avoid. Let's say, for argument's sake, now we're going into whichever season it is. So for us, it's easy. In South Africa, it's easy because Rosh Hashanah will be the beginning of the summer fruits, right? So choose not to have peaches from now until Rosh Hashanah. You could say shehechiyanu on a peach. But if you're eating peaches all year round, you can't say shehechiyanu even though it's a seasonal fruit. If you've been eating it all year. Okay, it's a whole halachic discussion on its own, right? And let's be clear, this is not a halacha shir, so anything that's shared over here is purely academic, and you still have to explore what the practical halacha is. I'm just illustrating the point, right?
That's the robust debate.
Exactly. But again, if the robust debate had not happened at the core principle level, we wouldn't even have the vocabulary to discuss these things. I'm saying the legal vocabulary. Because they did such a thorough and brutal job at that level, they provided us with the tools that we could use that can apply to many, many unexpected scenarios. And that's exactly what Gemorah is out to do. Okay, so the key, that tells you that we're coming up for a kasha, in other words, a textually based challenge to somebody's halachic opinion, is some variation of the word meisivei, eisivei, meisiv, etc. We're going to do one more for tonight, number 5. Oh, sorry, they challenged. He challenged. Eisivei is in singular, Mesiv is in plural, challenged. By the way, let's just make this a little bit more fun. Let's make this a little bit more fun. The grammatical association between Aramaic and Hebrew, because they are cousin languages, is that very often the shin of Hebrew becomes a tuf of Aramaic, which means
Hasidim talk like that.
no. Shin,
Okay.
shin, not se enter, she enter. Okay, so which means mesiv. Mesiv, if it were in Hebrew, would be meishiv. So similar to teshuvah. Because there are two ways I could respond. I could respond with an answer, or I could retort with a challenge. So mesive technically is actually from the same core root as the word to answer, ironically, because it is a response, just a challenging response. Okay, last thing for today, and that is what is called askafta, which is what everybody calls a kashya. Askafta means I have a logical issue with what you've said. Right? I can't bring any proof. Just like you said before, it doesn't sit right. Doesn't sit right. Something about the way you've explained this doesn't sit right. And the word that will introduce that is the word maskif. Or maskif la. Maskif. And the word toikef. Toikef is strength.
These usually not valid.
What do you mean not valid?
It's object of the
Very often valid. Very often valid.
valid.
I'm entitled to have a strong logical objection to what you've said. I'm entitled to, as long as I can provide sound logic. And if you can respond with equally sound logic, then you're okay. And if you can't,
Sounds like
then
you're
you've got a
objecting
problem.
emotionally, like.
no, it's got to be logic. It's got to be sound academic logic. For example, you could have said X, and I'll say, well, if you're saying X, that implies something else, and that doesn't work. Okay, so for example, let's just go back to our, this is very academic, so with no practical relevance. Let's just go back to our discussion about buying clothes during the Omer. I'll say, hey, hang on a second. So what you're saying is logic. You're saying that clothing is no longer such a big simcha that deserves a shechianu, right? That's what you're saying? So logically, you're telling me that the nature of what makes people celebrate in life has changed over time. So how come we can't listen to music during the Omer then? Because in those days, music was live. And today it's recorded music privately in my car. So by the same logic, if you're telling me that the nature of celebration has changed, maybe then the whole practice of the Omer should change. Right? And you then have to push back and say, no, you can't compare the two. But I'm entitled to raise a logical objection to something that you've said. And it needs to be addressed. If it's sound logic, it needs to be addressed. And by the way, sometimes the most powerful logical objection is pshita. That's self-evident. Why did you have to tell us something that is self-evident? Because Gemorah is not in the business of telling us the obvious. So sometimes the biggest challenge I can make to you is like, duh, which is the word pshita. That's obvious. You're going to see that word coming up a little bit later, I think. I'm pretty sure they have it here somewhere. No, shita is different. Shita is different. This is pshita. Pshita with a p at the beginning, with a pay at the beginning. Pshita. Okay, but pshita basically means like, why did you have to tell me that? It is self-evident. You'd then have to explain why a person may not have realized this point, and you had to go through the whole rigorous process of spelling it out. Okay, so that's sometimes the most unexpected challenge to something is you expect a challenge to say that makes no sense, that disagrees with the principle. Sometimes the challenge is, we know this already. Why are you telling me? Which is fascinating in its own right.
What's the English of the askafta? How would you?
It's hard to translate directly in English because it comes from the word to bring up like a hard ball, basically, from the word takif, which is strong. So I would just say askafta is he challenged logically, right? Or a logical challenge. Maskifla is the verb. He logically challenged a statement. Okay, lots of stuff, right?